What if I told you the United States was never meant to be united? What if I said that behind every star on that flag, there were tears, betrayals, and broken promises? When we look at a map of the USA today, with its 50 states stitched together under one name, it's tempting to believe that America was born as one great, singular idea. One country, one people, one dream. But that would be a lie. Because long before there was a flag, before the word United States even existed, and before the famous words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were ever written, there was just land. Land that stretched farther than the eye could see. Land that was sacred, not empty. It belonged to no one, yet sustained millions. 16,000 years ago, this vast territory we now call America was a world of untamed beauty. Towering mountains stood in silence. Rivers danced through endless forests, and the skies were alive with birds that have long since vanished. It wasn't an empty canvas. It was a breathing, thriving system. And the first people who arrived didn't come with flags or borders. They crossed from Asia to Alaska on a frozen land bridge, likely driven by survival, not conquest. These were the ancestors of Native Americans, the Inuit of the Arctic, the Lakota of the plains, the Hopi of the desert, the Navajo of the Southwest. They didn't build empires. They built relationships with the land. They didn't conquer nature. They sang to it. Their lives were rooted in harmony, reciprocity, and reverence. And then the ships came. With them came a new kind of vision, one not shaped by balance, but by ownership. We often say that America began in 1492 with Columbus, but to believe that is to erase thousands of years of memory. The truth is, history didn't begin with his arrival. It was disrupted by it. Columbus did not discover a new world. He intruded upon one. When he landed in the Caribbean, he thought he had reached India. He called the people Indians not out of knowledge, but out of error. That mistake, born in ignorance, would ripple across continents and centuries. Columbus returned to Europe not with an understanding of culture, but with stories of gold. And gold always brings greed. In the decades that followed, wave after wave of colonizers arrived. Spanish, French, Dutch, British. They weren't settlers seeking peace. They were agents of empire. They brought steel, smallpox, and slavery. They brought crosses, cannons, and contracts. And with every step inland, they carve away at the people who had lived here for millennia. Treaties were signed and broken. Lands were taken. Nations vanished. And somewhere along the way, the myth was born that this land was empty, wild, uncivilized, as if those already living here had never truly belonged. Even the English settlers who came seeking religious freedom, the famed pilgrims, carried contradiction in their sails. They escaped persecution only to establish communities that demanded strict conformity. They praised equality but excluded women, indigenous peoples, and the enslaved. Their famous Thanksgiving feast, shared with a native man named Squanto, is often remembered as a symbol of harmony. But what if it was actually a moment of mercy before a long storm of violence? The centuries that followed were not defined by unity, but by survival. 13 British colonies sprang up along the eastern coast, each with its own identity, rules, and reasons. By the time they rebelled against the British Crown in 1776, they were not fighting for one unified dream. They were fighting to protect 13 different interests under one fragile cause. The Declaration of Independence promised liberty and justice for all, but in practice, it left out most of humanity. Women were excluded. Black people were enslaved. Native Americans were ignored or erased. So let's not romanticize. Let's recognize. America was not born in unity. It was born in contradiction. Still, something extraordinary happened. This messy, violent, contradictory experiment survived. It didn't collapse under the weight of its hypocrisies. It grew. It stumbled forward. The very thing that could have torn it apart. Its diversity, its dissent, became, paradoxically, the fuel that kept it alive. Because America was never about being perfect. It was about becoming. And that's why we're here. This is not just a history lesson. This is a journey into the wounds, the wars, the promises kept and broken, and the people, named and unnamed, who shaped the most paradoxical nation on earth. From the enslaved to the empowered, the forgotten to the celebrated, the rebels to the refugees, we will walk through their stories. Because if you want to understand America, don't ask, when did it begin? Ask instead, what has it survived? Long before anyone called it America, before stars and stripes waved in the wind, before the sound of English or Spanish or French ever echoed across its valleys, there was a land that breathed in silence. It had no name, no borders, no rulers. It simply was. This land stretched from frozen glaciers in the far north to sun-scorched deserts in the south, from the craggy cliffs of the Pacific coast to the flat, wind-whipped prairies that rolled eastward until they met the Atlantic Ocean. It was vast, raw, wild, and above all, sacred, though no one yet called it that. There were no cities, no nations, no flagpoles stabbing the soil. Just time, just trees, just life. 16,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, this great land was not empty. It was untouched. It pulsed with the sounds of creatures now long extinct. Giant sloths lumbered beneath towering redwoods. Saber-toothed cats stalked prey near still, mirror-like lakes. Herds of mammoths thundered across snow-packed plains where nothing human had ever set foot. The skies shimmered with northern lights. The stars were so bright they cast shadows. In this stillness, the earth waited. And then, for the first time, footsteps broke the silence. The first people didn't arrive with war or conquest in their hearts. They arrived with hunger, hope, courage. They had walked thousands of miles from Siberia across what we now call the Bering Land Bridge, an icy corridor that once connected Asia to Alaska. These were not tourists. They were survivors, migrants not by choice but by necessity, moving in small bands, following herds, chasing warmth, fleeing scarcity. They had no maps, no written language, and yet they carried with them something far more powerful than tools. They carried stories. These early humans didn't conquer the land. They listened to it, watched it, learned its rhythms, and in doing so, they survived. Over generations, they spread slowly, like rivers carving their own paths. Some moved south through what is now Canada, down into the grasslands and forests of North America. Others continued into Central America, giving rise to civilizations like the Maya, the Aztecs, and eventually the Inca. In the far north, some remained in what would become the Arctic, evolving into the Inuit, braving temperatures colder than death, thriving in places most modern humans would never endure. We often imagine the past as primitive, but these first people were astronomers, engineers, and poets in their own way. They learned to plant corn that could grow in poor soil. They built earthen mounds aligned with the stars. They crafted tools so sharp that modern steel barely outperforms them. They made music with bones, fire with friction, homes from nothing but hide and stone. Their languages, over 2,000 of them, flowed like rivers, each one telling stories of ancestors, animals, spirits, and sky. They didn't believe they owned the land. They believed they were part of it. To walk upon the earth was not to conquer it. It was to be in conversation with it. Trees weren't lumber. They were family. Rivers weren't resources. They were bloodlines. The bison weren't meat. They were teachers, guides, and sacred givers of life. Every mountain had a name. Every stone had a memory. Every death had a ritual. This wasn't Eden. There were conflicts, hardships, starvation. But there was no greed for endless expansion. No hunger for domination. Just life, woven into a complex web of respect, reverence, and rhythm. But then came the first betrayal, not by another tribe, but by the earth itself. The Ice Age ended. The climate changed. Glaciers melted. Seas rose. The land bridge disappeared beneath water. The great mammals, mammoths, giant bison, saber-tooths, vanished. Some say they were hunted into extinction. Others say they simply couldn't survive the changing world. Whatever the cause, the people adapted once again. They hunted smaller game. They grew more food. They stayed in one place longer. Villages formed. Trade routes blossomed. And slowly, a quiet empire of cooperation emerged, not ruled by kings or gods, but by an unspoken code of balance. From the woodlawns of the Iroquois to the deserts of the Hopi, from the rivers of the Mississippians to the plains of the Lakota, this vast, unwritten civilization endured, not in monuments, but in memory. And for thousands of years, it worked. No kings, no borders, no wars for oil, for land, for power. Just people living with the land, not above it. So when the first ships arrived from across the Atlantic, their sails fat with wind and ambition, they didn't find natives. They found nations. They didn't discover land. They trespassed. They didn't bring light. They brought noise, metal, smoke, fire, and hunger. And that's the part of the story we rarely tell. That before America was a dream, it was a home. Before it was a battleground, it was a sanctuary. Before it was divided, it was deeply connected, person to person, spirit to soil, life to land. What would happen next would shake the continent to its core. But in order to understand that violence, we must first understand what was lost. Because the story of America doesn't start with freedom. It starts with forgetting. Before there were colonies, before the word America was ever whispered by European lips, there were people here, millions of them. People who belonged to hundreds of distinct nations, speaking thousands of languages, living in every climate from frozen tundra to sweltering bayou. These people didn't see themselves as a single group. They were Iroquois, Comanche, Hopi, Lakota, Zuni, Choctaw, Shawnee, Apache, Mohican, Cherokee, Ojibwe, Pueblo, and more. Each with their own governance, their own systems of justice, their own stories of creation. Their ways were not primitive. They were sophisticated. They had constitutions before the Constitution, diplomacy before the diplomats, education without textbooks, wisdom passed down in stories, not syllables. Their world was not empty, waiting to be filled. It was already full of relationships. Relationships with rivers and wind, with deer and eagle, with fire and shadow. They lived not in castles or cities of stone, but in homes that breathed with the seasons, teepees that could move with herds, adobe that held the heat of the desert, long houses that stretched through the forests like wooden spines. Their calendars followed the moon. Their justice was communal. Their wealth was not measured in gold, but in what could be given, not hoarded. But then a new kind of people came, not as neighbors, not as wanderers, but as takers. At first, it was cautious, the meeting of two worlds. Explorers arrived, awkward and uncertain, confused by the landscape, bewildered by the native hospitality. The Taino, on the islands Columbus stumbled upon, greeted the strangers with food and gifts. And in return, they were enslaved, beaten, taken. That would set the pattern. In the early 1600s, when the British built their first settlements, Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, they were not alone. Native people lived all around them. And at first, those natives saved them. When the settlers starved, it was the native peoples who taught them how to plant maize, how to hunt in unfamiliar forests, how to live in a land that did not bend to European logic. Squanto, a man who had been kidnapped years earlier, taken to Europe, and somehow returned home, helped the pilgrims plant their first crops. He even translated. He even mediated. He helped them survive. And still they took more. The settlers came not to adapt, but to impose. Their language, their religion, their ownership. Land could not be shared, only claimed. Treaties were not sacred. They were conveniences. Agreements were made and broken, again and again, often before the ink dried. Whenever land was needed, this savage label returned, and with it came justifications for expulsion, for extermination, for genocide. The betrayal wasn't just one moment. It was a slow erosion. 1,000 broken promises. 1,000 invisible wounds. And yet, Native people didn't disappear. They resisted. In the 1600s and 1700s, dozens of wars erupted between Native nations and colonial forces. King Philip's War, the Powhatan Wars, the Yamasee War, the Beaver Wars. These were not chaotic uprisings. They were organized defenses. They were efforts to protect land, family, survival. But the colonizers had something the Native peoples did not. Numbers, guns, disease. By the time George Washington marched through the woods of the Ohio Valley, the land had already bled. Entire nations had vanished. Smallpox alone wiped out an estimated 90% of indigenous populations in some regions, before settlers ever raised a sword. Blankets infected with disease were sometimes knowingly given to Native families. The land that once sang with stories now echoed with silence. And still they endured. By the 1800s, as the new American nation grew in ambition, it also grew in cruelty. The policy was clear: removal. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, a law that would forcibly relocate tens of thousands of Native people from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to a region west of the Mississippi River. It was called the Trail of Tears, and it lived up to the name. Over 15,000 Cherokee were marched from Georgia to present-day Oklahoma, through blizzards, over mountains, across rivers. Over 4,000 of them died along the way, many of them children, elders, pregnant mothers. They were not marching toward freedom. They were being erased. And that's the bitter truth about the founding of America. For one people to rise, another had to fall. For every state added to the Union, there was a homeland taken. For every railroad track laid across the West, there was a herd of buffalo slaughtered, a sacred site defiled. When the government wanted land for settlers, it simply moved the Indians again, and again, and again. The resistance never stopped. There was the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, when Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led the Lakota and Cheyenne to a stunning victory over General Custer's troops. For a brief moment, it seemed that Native warriors could still protect their homes, their dignity. But the celebration did not last. In 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of Native armed resistance in the United States. Hundreds of unarmed Lakota men, women, and children were killed by American soldiers in a snowy field in South Dakota. Their bodies left frozen in the blood-stained snow. The survivors were scattered, and the silence returned. By 1900, the once great herds of buffalo had been decimated, hunted not just for meat, but to destroy the Native way of life. Where there had once been 60 million buffalo, fewer than 1,000 remained. And where there had once been over 2 million Native people, only 250,000 were left. Forced onto reservations, isolated, impoverished, surveilled. The betrayal didn't end with land. It continued through education. Native children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were stripped of their language, their names, their clothing, their ceremonies. Their hair was cut, their voices silenced. They were taught that their culture was shameful, their identity is sin. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the motto of these institutions. And many children never came home. And yet, they still endured. In the 20th century, Native voices began to rise again. In 1969, activists occupied Alcatraz Island for over a year, demanding justice, visibility, and respect. In 1973, the American Indian movement staged a standoff at Wounded Knee, reminding the nation that the wounds had never healed. And today, Native leaders fight not just for land, but for water, language, recognition, dignity. From Standing Rock to the Supreme Court, the struggle continues. And still they endure. The story of Native Americans is not a footnote. It is the foundation. And the betrayal they suffered is not ancient. It is ongoing. Their lands continue to be taken for pipelines and profit. Their communities suffer from the highest rates of poverty addiction, suicide, and disappearances. Native women are murdered at alarming rates. Many of their cases unsolved, uninvestigated, ignored. Their languages are disappearing. Their traditions are mocked, commodified, or erased. And yet they remain, creating art, leading protests, running for office, teaching the next generation what was stolen from them. Because to be Native in America is not to be extinct, it is to be defiant, to be the living memory of a truth this country still struggles to face. That freedom built on erasure is not freedom at all. That a nation that forgets its original caretakers will never fully know who it is. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the story of America has always been uneasy, because its heart is built on a wound that never closed. And the land remembers. It always remembers. The fall of the First Peoples was not just a tragedy. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One written not in ink, but in iron and ambition. What followed after the first betrayals wasn't a pause for reflection. It was an explosion of ships, of flags, of fire. The so-called Age of Discovery didn't begin with a question. It began with a hunger. For gold, for land, for glory. In European courts, kings and queens sat upon thrones draped in velvet and debt. Their coffers were running dry. Their empires strained by wars and extravagance. Across the ocean lay something they could barely imagine. Rumors of kingdoms paved in silver, mountains filled with emeralds, rivers that ran with gold. They didn't know what lay across the Atlantic, but they knew what they wanted from it, wealth without end. And so the ships came. First Spain, with its caravels cutting through wind and time. Then Portugal, sleek and silent. Then France, England, and the Dutch, each with its own cross, its own flag, its own justification. They called it exploration. But for the people who lived on these lands, it was the arrival of erasure. Christopher Columbus is often credited with discovering America in 1492. But that word, discover, is a lie dressed in velvet. Because how can you discover something that already has names, languages, cities, temples, and memory? When Columbus landed in the Bahamas, he didn't find an empty beach. He found a Taino, a people with their own rich culture, their own music, their own gods. Within decades, that culture would be almost entirely annihilated. Columbus did not find paradise. He found opportunity. He saw gentle people wearing beads instead of armor, living in harmony with the land, and he saw how easily they could be conquered. In his own journals, he wrote that with 50 men, he could subjugate all of them. And that's exactly what happened. The Taino were enslaved, forced to mine gold until their bodies gave out. Those who resisted were maimed or murdered. Those who survived were decimated by disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses they had never encountered before. Within a generation, the islands were silent. But the silence did not stop the ships. Columbus returned to Europe a hero, not for who he had met, but for what he had taken. The news spread like wildfire through royal courts. The New World was now the ultimate prize, not because it was beautiful, but because it was profitable. Spain sent more. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico and burned his ships to send a message. There would be no retreat. His eyes were fixed on the Aztec Empire, a sprawling, sophisticated civilization of pyramids, poets, warriors, and astronomers. But none of that mattered. To Cortés, they were obstacles to treasure. With fewer than 1,000 men, he brought down an empire of millions, not with brute force, but with betrayal, manipulation, and disease. The same would happen to the Inca, high in the Andes, where Francisco Pizarro staged one of the greatest thefts in human history, tricking an emperor into peace, then executing him, then looting his temples and enslaving his people. But make no mistake, this wasn't about spreading civilization. It wasn't about faith. It was about gold. Gold, the metal that blinded morality. Gold, the shining symbol of divine favor. Gold, the poison in the bloodstream of every empire. And the Spanish took tons of it. Literally, ships heavy with gold and silver sailed back to Europe. But not before enslaving thousands, destroying sacred sites, and rewriting the narrative. They called it salvation, but it was plunder. While Spain carved its empire in the south, the French moved through the north, trading furs, forming fragile alliances with some native nations, and staking claim to forests and rivers they had no part in tending. The British came next, planting their flags along the eastern seaboard, claiming Virginia in the name of a queen who had never set foot on its soil. And the Dutch, always the merchants, claimed islands and harbors that would later become Manhattan. Each colonial power brought its own brand of control, but the tools were always the same: guns, germs, and God. The gun was power, raw, immediate, unarguable. Against muskets and cannons, arrows, and spears meant nothing. Indigenous resistance was brave, strategic, but ultimately crushed by superior firepower. Germs were the silent assassin. Whole villages fell in days. Leaders died before they could plan defense. Children coughed, bled, and vanished. Entire languages disappeared with their last speaker. And then there was God, or rather, the weaponized idea of God. Missionaries came cloaked in white, with rosaries and Bibles, telling the native peoples that their gods were false, their stories were sins, their ways were wrong. Children were baptized in languages they didn't speak. Sacred dances were banned. Ceremonies were outlawed. In some cases, elders were executed for refusing to convert. The logic was clear. The only path to salvation was to surrender your soul, your name, your identity. And if you didn't surrender, you were destroyed. This wasn't discovery. This was extraction. The land was not admired. It was stripped. Forests were cut down to build ships and forts. Rivers were diverted. Animals were hunted into extinction. And everywhere the colonizers went, they asked the same question: how can this serve us? They built plantations. They imported enslaved Africans to work the land when the native populations could no longer meet their demands, either because they had died or because they had fled. The Americas became a vast machine of wealth production. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, all grown with blood, harvested in pain, exported in silence. And still, the hunger was not satisfied. As the colonies grew, so did their demands. More land, more labor, more extraction. Treaties with native peoples were made on Monday and broken by Friday. Colonizers would arrive, point at a hill or a river, and claim it for the crown. If anyone protested, they were labeled hostile, uncivilized, dangerous. The irony is unbearable. The invaders were afraid of being invaded, and so they built forts, drew maps, drew lines, as if ink could erase memory, as if borders could undo belonging, as if ownership could be legitimized by violence. What began as discovery had become domination. By the early 1700s, most of the east coast of what would become the United States had been claimed by European powers. The native peoples who once thrived there had been reduced to pockets, reservations, or cemeteries. The land that once sang with stories now groaned under the weight of monoculture, greed, and graves. And yet, just like in the chapters before, some resisted. Some adapted. Some vanished into the woods. Others fought in courtrooms. Some intermarried. Others passed their traditions in whispers, through songs, in tattoos hidden beneath sleeves, in names given in secret. Because what the colonizers never understood is that land remembers. Spirit remembers. A people may be scattered, but they are not erased. A song may be forbidden, but it will still hum in the bones. And so even as gold filled the vaults of kings, even as maps were redrawn, even as flags were planted, even as churches rose on stolen soil, something else remained beneath the surface. A quiet rage, a sacred grief, and a question that has never stopped echoing. Who gets to call it discovery when someone else has to disappear? They came not for gold, not for conquest, not for kings. The people who boarded the Mayflower in 1620 were different, or at least they believed they were. These are not adventurers. They were believers, English men and women, fleeing religious persecution, fleeing a country where the state controlled the soul. They were Puritans, strict, serious, devout. Their eyes didn't burn with greed. They burned with conviction. In England, they had been silenced, fined, imprisoned. Their desire to worship freely had been treated as rebellion. So they left behind everything, homes, farms, families, and set sail across a vast and uncertain ocean. They called themselves pilgrims, and they weren't chasing wealth. They were chasing God. The journey was brutal. The Mayflower was no majestic vessel. It was small, damp, and foul with the stench of bodies packed too close together. Men prayed. Women wept. Children vomited. Storms battered the ship like a curse. And yet they endured, fueled by the belief that a better life, a freer life, waited on the other side. They landed not where they had planned, but in a cold, unfamiliar place we now call Massachusetts. The wind bit through their coats. Snow covered the soil they had hoped to plant. It was late in the season. Crops were impossible. Many fell ill. Many died. Half of the original 102 settlers would not survive that first winter. But then came a stranger. A native man, dark-eyed and soft-spoken, walked into their midst and said one word in perfect English. Welcome. His name was Squanto. Years earlier, he had been kidnapped by English explorers, sold into slavery in Spain, and somehow made his way to London. There, he learned the language of the people who had stolen him. Eventually, he returned to his homeland, only to find his entire tribe dead from disease. He had every reason to hate the newcomers, and yet he helped them. He taught them how to plant corn in the rocky soil, how to use fish to fertilize the land, how to navigate the local tribes and avoid war. That spring, he saved them. In the autumn of 1621, the Pilgrims held a feast to give thanks. They invited the Wampanoag people, whose chief, Massasoit, had signed a peace agreement with them. They sat together, ate together, shared what they had, and for a brief, flickering moment, there was harmony. Today, we call it Thanksgiving. But the harmony would not last. The Pilgrims, like many colonists, believed that freedom belonged to them, not to everyone. Their definition of liberty was narrow, their compassion conditional. They had fled religious oppression, yes, but not to build a land of tolerance. They came to build a land where they could be in charge. If your beliefs aligned with theirs, you were welcome. If not, you were dangerous. They banned other religions, persecuted dissenters, publicly whipped anyone who questioned the church. They hanged women accused of witchcraft, expelled thinkers who suggested God might speak in ways they didn't recognize. One man, Roger Williams, suggested that perhaps Native people had rights. For that, he was banished. He fled into the wilderness and founded Rhode Island, a place where faith and freedom could coexist. A rare exception, but even in Rhode Island, the contradiction remained. The colonists prayed with one hand and fenced land with the other. They thanked God for survival, even as they claimed land that was not theirs. They built churches with wood cut from native forests. They sang hymns over the graves of the very people who had helped them live. Because no matter how devout the settlers were, they had absorbed one dangerous idea, that this land was a gift from God to them alone. This belief was reinforced by scripture twisted to justify conquest. They compared themselves to the Israelites, God's chosen people, crossing the desert into the promised land. The native inhabitants were cast as Canaanites, pagan, primitive, destined to be swept away. This was not just colonization. It was seen as divine destiny. And once you believe that God is on your side, every act becomes righteous, even theft, even war. So when conflicts with native tribes arose, as they inevitably did, the settlers framed it as spiritual battle. When the Pequot tribe resisted English encroachment in 1637, the settlers responded with fire. They burned an entire Pequot village to the ground, killing hundreds of men, women, and children in the night. Those who tried to flee were cut down. Afterwards, the colonists held a day of thanksgiving, not for peace, but for victory. This is the part of the story we rarely tell, that the same people who sought religious freedom for themselves denied it to others, that their prayers were sincere, but their actions were soaked in blood. And yet, they didn't see the paradox. Or if they did, they justified it. They told themselves that the native people were doomed anyway, that disease, ignorance, and disobedience to God would be their undoing. They believed they were civilizing a wilderness, bringing order to chaos. planting light in darkness. But here's the truth. The land was never wild. It was just unfamiliar. The people were never savages. They were just different. As more Puritans arrived in the 1630s and 40s, the settlements grew rapidly. Towns sprang up. Churches multiplied. Harvard University was founded in 1636, not as a secular school, but as a place to train ministers. Education and religion were intertwined. The pulpit ruled the village. And from that pulpit, the paradox continued to spread. In the southern colonies, another contradiction took root: Christianity and slavery. Landowners who praised Jesus on Sunday bought and sold human beings on Monday. They taught the enslaved to pray, but forbade them to read. They spoke of souls while chaining bodies, and they did so in the name of faith. The Pilgrims had no slaves at first, but soon, as tobacco became profitable in Virginia, as sugar plantations spread in the Caribbean, the moral wall crumbled. Labor was needed, profit demanded it, and religion, once again, adjusted. Verses were found, rationales invented, and the gospel was twisted until it could fit neatly inside a slave ship. Back in New England, native resistance mounted. Metacomet, the son of Massasoit, the same chief who had once shared a feast, took up arms against the colonists. He was known to the English as King Philip. His war, from 1675 to 1678, was one of the bloodiest in colonial history. Entire towns were burned. Both sides committed atrocities. And when Metacomet was finally defeated, his body was dismembered and his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. That's how fast peace can rot. That's how quickly gratitude becomes conquest. The Pilgrims came here with dreams. But those dreams were shaped by fear, by control, by hierarchy. They did not trust diversity. They feared difference. And so they built fences not just of wood but of thought. And yet, we still tell their story as if it were pure. We dress school children as pilgrims and Indians. We draw smiling turkeys and paper hats. We celebrate the feast, but not the famine. We remember the dinner, but not the death. The paradox persists because America's foundation was not just built on freedom. It was built on selective freedom, on conditional grace, on the idea that some people deserve liberty and others do not. And that idea, once planted, would take root in every corner of the continent. It would echo in plantations, in courtrooms, in jails, in boarding schools, in border walls, in war zones. Because the deepest paradox of all, the one we still struggle with, is this: can a nation built on exclusion ever fully understand inclusion? Can a dream born from narrowness ever grow wide enough to hold us all? That question has never been answered, only asked, again and again and again. It didn't start with gunshots. It started with taxes, not with dreams of freedom echoing through mountaintops, but with a cup of tea. And yet, that cup would spill into a revolution. By the mid-1700s, the British colonies in North America had grown strong. There were farms, towns, churches, roads. From Massachusetts to Georgia, 13 distinct colonies had formed, each with its own character, each with its own rhythms. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension brewed. These colonies belonged, legally and economically, to the British Crown. But they were no longer children. They were becoming something else, restless, capable, ambitious. At first, the arrangement had been simple. The colony supplied raw materials: timber, tobacco, sugar, cotton. In return, Britain sent back goods, tools, textiles, luxuries. But this was no partnership. It was empire. The rules were made in London. The profits flowed back across the Atlantic. And the colonists, they were expected to obey. For a while they did. But then came the French and Indian War, a brutal conflict fought between Britain and France and their respective native allies for control over North American territory. The British won, but at a staggering cost. There were debts piled high. Parliament needed money. And where do empires look when they're broke? Their colonies. The British government passed law after law, tax after tax: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, each one designed to extract more wealth from the American colonies. But these weren't just economic burdens. They were insults. The colonists were not consulted. They had no vote in Parliament, no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives, no taxation without representation. That phrase began to echo through taverns, pamphlets, and church pulpits. At first, it was a protest slogan, but soon it became a rallying cry. And then came the tea. In 1773, Parliament granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. The Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea, but it undercut local merchants and reinforced Britain's right to tax the colonies without consent. The message was clear. The price of tea may be cheaper, but the price of obedience was higher. In Boston, that message was not received politely. On a cold December night, a group of men, some dressed as Mohawk Indians, their faces painted in symbolic defiance, boarded 3 ships in the harbor. They opened 342 crates of tea and dumped them into the sea. The salt water turned brown. The harbor smelled of rebellion. The British called it treason. The colonists called it the Boston Tea Party. The punishment was swift. Parliament passed the coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's harbor was closed. Self-government was suspended. British soldiers were quartered in colonial homes. The noose tightened, but something had changed. Up and down the coast, other colonies took notice. This wasn't just Boston's fight anymore. It was becoming everyone's. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Men who had once been farmers, blacksmiths, lawyers, and ministers now sat together as proto-statesmen. They didn't yet demand independence, but they did demand rights. They sent a petition to King George III begging for redress, not revolution. The king ignored them. The following spring, the powder keg exploded. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward the town of Concord to seize weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But in Lexington, they encountered a small band of colonial militiamen. No one knows who fired the first shot, but that shot, fired in the morning mist, would become known as the shot heard round the world. 8 colonists were killed. The British pressed forward, but were met by more resistance in Concord. And as they retreated toward Boston, colonial farmers, tradesmen, and boys, many of whom had never fired a gun in anger, lined the roads, firing from behind trees, fences, and stone walls. It was not organized warfare. It was desperation. It was defiance. And it worked. The British were shaken. By the summer, war was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775. This time, they chose a commander for the colonial army, a tall, quiet man from Virginia named George Washington. He wasn't the most experienced general, but he carried himself with honor, humility, and resolve. He became the face of the rebellion, reluctant, dignified, and determined. Still, not everyone wanted a break from Britain. Many colonists considered themselves loyal subjects. They saw rebellion as reckless, even sinful. But the tide was turning. That winter, a pamphlet swept through the colonies like wildfire. It was called Common Sense, written by a little-known writer named Thomas Paine. In plain, fiery language, Paine argued that monarchy was an outdated, immoral system. He urged the colonists not just to protest, but to separate. He spoke not to the heads of politicians, but to the hearts of farmers. "'Tis time apart," he wrote, and many agreed. By July 1776, the decision had been made. The colonies would not be subjects. They would be sovereign. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved the document that would shake the world, the Declaration of Independence. It was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian with a poet's soul and a lawyer's pen. In it, he laid out a radical premise, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was beautiful. It was bold. It was also hypocritical. Jefferson owned slaves. So did many of the signers. The document spoke of freedom, but the reality was more complicated. Women were excluded. Indigenous peoples were labeled merciless savages. Enslaved Africans were not even considered. The dream was noble, but it was selective. Still, for the people of the colonies, it was a turning point. They were no longer rebels. They were now a nation in its infancy, a nation born in protest, baptized in ink, and destined for war. The war would last 8 bloody years. The British were the most powerful military on earth. Trained soldiers, endless resources, global reach. The Americans were outnumbered, underfunded, underfed. Their army sometimes lacked shoes, bullets, or even food. But they had something Britain did not: conviction and home field advantage. In time, the war took many turns, battles won and lost, alliances formed and broken. In 1781, with help from France, the Americans forced a decisive surrender at Yorktown. British General Cornwallis laid down his arms, and though some fighting continued, the war was over. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The colonies were now states. The rebels were now citizens. The revolution was now history. But victory brought questions. Who would lead? How would they govern? Who would be included? Who would be left out? The answers would take generations to unfold. Because revolution is not a destination. It is a door. And beyond that door stood all the contradictions, all the paradoxes, all the unfinished promises of a nation that had broken from a king, but not from its own ghosts. They had won their freedom from a king. They had declared themselves independent. They had written a constitution, built a government, created a flag. And yet, less than a century after the birth of the United States, the nation stood at the edge of collapse, not from an outside enemy, but from a war within its own heart. Because the truth is this: America was not one country. It was two. Not a name, perhaps. Not on maps, but in soul. The North and the South had always been different. Different economies, different cultures, different visions of what freedom meant. In the North, industry was rising: textiles, steel, commerce. Cities were growing. Railroads stretched like veins across stone and snow. In the South, it was still the old world: cotton fields, plantations, wide porches, and slow afternoons. But underneath those fields was a system soaked in blood: slavery. Millions of black men, women, and children lived in bondage, bought and sold like cattle, whipped, branded, raped, torn from their families. They had no legal rights, no wages, no protection. They built the wealth of the South with broken hands and shattered backs. And though the Constitution had spoken of liberty, it had allowed this contradiction to fester. For decades, politicians tried to paper over the divide. Compromises were written. States were admitted in pairs, one free, one slave. Everyone knew the balance was fragile, but few were willing to face it. Slavery was not just a Southern problem. It was an American one. The North benefited from cheap cotton. Northern banks financed Southern plantations. Northern ships carried enslaved bodies across oceans. But something was changing. A movement had begun, small at first, but growing. Abolitionists, mostly in the North, began to speak. Right? Organize. They published newspapers like The Liberator. They gave fiery speeches. They sheltered runaways. They called slavery what it truly was: a sin. And then came the stories. Stories that pierced the conscience of a nation. One of them was Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman who had never seen a plantation but understood suffering. Her novel told the story of an enslaved man, Tom, whose faith and kindness could not save him from brutality. The book spread like wildfire. In the North, it inspired tears and outrage. In the South, it provoked fury. The lines were being drawn, not just in fields, but in hearts. Then came 1850. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that required even free states to return escaped, enslaved people to their owners. No court, no hearing, just capture and return. It turned every free state into hunting grounds. It forced Northerners to become accomplices, and it radicalized many who had once stayed silent. In response, a secret network of safe houses and brave souls, known as the Underground Railroad, grew stronger. Men and women, black and white, risked everything to lead people to freedom. One of them was Harriet Tubman. She escaped slavery, but went back again and again, guiding hundreds to safety. Armed, determined, and faithful, she became known as Moses. And yet, the center would not hold. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered its most shameful ruling, the Dred Scott decision. It declared that black people, enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights a white man was bound to respect. It invalidated the Missouri Compromise. It sent a clear message: slavery was not going away. It would expand. But then, in 1860, something unexpected happened. A tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois was elected president. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't an abolitionist, not at first, but he believed slavery was morally wrong. He believed the country could not survive divided. He once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And the South listened. Within weeks of his election, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Then Mississippi, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. One by one, the southern states left, forming their own nation, the Confederate States of America. They wrote a constitution that protected slavery. They chose Jefferson Davis as their president. They raised their own flag. And on April 12, 1861, they fired the first shot on Fort Sumter, a Union fort in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. It was not quick. It was not clean. It was not heroic. It was a slaughter. Families were torn apart, brother against brother, father against son. Towns were turned into graves, fields into trenches. The war lasted 4 long, bloody years. Over 600,000 people died, more than all other American wars combined. Disease killed more than bullets. Amputations were done without anesthesia. Letters home were soaked in blood and regret. But through it all, Lincoln remained. He had no taste for glory. He carried the war on his shoulders like a burden. He walked alone, wept alone, and when the time was right, he made a decision that would change history, not just for America, but for the world. On January 1st, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were now free. It didn't free everyone. It was as much a political move as a moral one. But it changed the war. Now, it was not just a fight for union. It was a fight for freedom. And thousands of black men joined the Union Army. They fought not just for a flag, but for a future. One of the turning points came at Gettysburg, a 3-day battle in Pennsylvania, the bloodiest of the war. The Union won, but at a terrible cost. Lincoln visited the battlefield months later. He gave a speech, just 271 words. It became immortal. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But it nearly did. In April 1865, after a brutal campaign, Union forces cornered the Confederate Army. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant was gracious. There was no punishment, no humiliation, just an end to bloodshed. The war was over. But peace was fragile. 5 days later, Lincoln went to the theater. He needed a night of rest. He never left. John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, shot him in the back of the head. The president who had held the Union together died in silence, with a grieving nation at his feet. And the question remained, what now? Slavery was gone, but racism was not. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its pride wounded. Reconstruction began, but it was met with resistance. New laws were written to keep black people in poverty, in chains of a different kind. The Ku Klux Klan rose like a ghost, spreading terror. Lynchings became common. Voting was suppressed. Schools were segregated. Separate but equal became the new lie. And yet, progress crawled forward. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship. The 15th gave black men the right to vote. But rights on paper are not always rights in practice. The war had ended, but the wound had not healed, and maybe it never fully will. Because the Civil War was not just about geography. It was about humanity, about who counts, about whether freedom is a birthright or a privilege, about whether a country can survive its own contradictions. America did not fall apart, but it came closer than ever before, and the blood that soaked its soil still whispers in its roots. Freedom didn't come with a parade. It came with silence. When the guns of the Civil War finally fell quiet, when the white flags fluttered in broken fields, when the documents were signed and the soldiers went home, millions of black Americans were suddenly, legally, no longer property. But they were not yet people. They were free, but homeless. Free, but penniless. Free, but surrounded by those who had once owned them, fed by hands that had once whipped them, judged by laws that had never seen them as human. The shackles had been broken, but the cage remained. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime. And that exception would become the loophole that swallowed generations. Southern states, furious at their loss, enacted laws that turned everyday life into a trap. These laws were known as the Black Codes. Under them, a black man could be arrested for loitering, for standing still too long, for vagrancy, for not having a job, even though no one would hire him, for speaking to a white woman, for looking threatening, for merely existing in the wrong place. Once arrested, they could be leased to plantations, to mines, to railroads, forced to work for free. Again, it was slavery dressed in law. The South called it justice, but it was vengeance. Freedmen tried to build lives from nothing. Some searched for family, walking hundreds of miles with only hope in a name. Others squatted on abandoned land, planting whatever they could. Churches were formed, sacred spaces of song and resilience. Schools were built, tiny rooms filled with sunlight and dreams. But every step forward was met with a hand pushing back. Former Confederates regained power quickly, and with that power came hate reborn. In white robes and burning crosses, the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows. They called themselves defenders of Southern honor, but they were cowards, riding at night, burning homes, hanging men from trees. Their message was clear: you're not welcome here. And yet they stayed. Black Americans did not vanish. They did not bow. They endured. Some became landowners. Others became teachers, preachers, mayors, poets. They formed communities, resilient, vibrant, full of spirit. They created newspapers, businesses, sororities, and fraternities. They celebrated Emancipation Day. They wrote their own history. But the nation itself was split in two, not North and South, but white and black. In 1896, the Supreme Court delivered a devastating blow. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the court ruled that racial segregation was legal, as long as it was separate but equal. But separate is never equal. It never was. Across the country, black children were sent to crumbling schools with outdated books and no resources. Black families were denied loans, housing, safety. Black soldiers fought in wars for a country that would not let them sit at the front of the bus. Lynchings continued, public, brutal, photographed, sometimes turned into postcards. And the law stood silent. But behind the silence, something else grew. A movement, an underground fight, not in basements, but in classrooms, in pulpits, in barbershops, in lunch counters, in freedom songs, in poetry slams, in marches, boycotts, hunger strikes, and bold defiance. There was Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery and taught himself to read, who wrote and spoke and stared down presidents. His voice thundered across oceans. He said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." There was Ida B. Wells, a journalist who risked her life to investigate lynchings, to name the dead, to expose the truth. Her printing press was burned, but her voice could not be silenced. There was Booker T. Washington, who preached education and economic strength, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who demanded nothing less than full equality. They disagreed, but their disagreement was part of a shared truth. There were many roads to freedom, and every one of them was uphill. In the early 20th century, the Great Migration began. Millions of black Americans left the South, heading north and west, searching for work, for dignity, for air to breathe. They arrived in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles. They brought their food, their music, their prayers. And from their struggle came jazz. the blues, gospel, rock and roll. They turned pain into art, loss into rhythm, anger into brilliance. And yet, the racism followed them. Redlining kept them out of good neighborhoods. Sundown towns warned them to leave before dark. Police brutality was as real in New York as it had been in Georgia. But still they built. Then came World War II. Black soldiers fought and died under the American flag. But when they returned home, they were denied the GI Bill, denied housing, denied employment, denied gratitude. In uniform, they had been heroes. In civilian clothes, they were threats. And yet they kept marching. In 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was not the first, but she was the spark. Her arrest launched the Montgomery bus boycott, a protest that lasted over a year. Led by a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., the boycott showed the world what dignity looked like under pressure. Dr. King preached nonviolence. He preached love. But make no mistake, his love was fierce. He marched in Selma, was arrested in Birmingham, spoke in Washington. He said, "I have a dream." But he also said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." He was not naive. He was brave. Others rose beside him. Malcolm X, who demanded freedom by any means necessary. Fannie Lou Hamer, who said she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. John Lewis, who crossed a bridge and was beaten nearly to death for it. They faced water hoses, police dogs, prison, assassination. They faced laws and lies and loaded guns. And still they walked. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the ballot. Black Americans had one legal equality. But social equality? Economic justice? The right to exist without fear? That was still a dream. Even today, the underground fight continues. In classrooms where Black history is erased. In courtrooms where justice is not blind. In neighborhoods starved of investment. In prisons overflowing with Black bodies. In headlines that forget names like Breonna, Ahmaud, Tamir, and George. But there is also power in the voices of young organizers, in the brilliance of Black scientists, artists, engineers, athletes, and educators, in the legacy of those who never stopped believing that freedom is not a gift. It is a right and a fight. Because the story of Black America is not a story of victimhood. It is a story of survival with grace, of resistance with rhythm, of hope under fire. It is America's greatest wound, and also its greatest promise. Because if a nation that once enslaved millions can learn to listen, to heal, to transform, then perhaps this experiment in democracy is not lost. Perhaps the dream is not broken, just unfinished. And perhaps, just perhaps, those who were once seen as the least were always the ones carrying the soul of the nation forward. It begins the same way every time, with a suitcase. Sometimes it's made of leather, sometimes plastic, sometimes just a bundle tied in cloth. But what matters isn't what's inside, it's what's left behind. Behind that suitcase lies a home that could no longer hold them. A place where dreams dried up, where freedom was fenced off, where hunger gnawed, where bombs fell, where futures vanished. And ahead, a name whispered like salvation. America, the land of possibility, the place where anyone can make it, the country of clean slates and second chances, of streets paved in gold, or at least something better than dust and silence. But when immigrants arrived, they didn't step into a dream. They stepped into a test. In the 1800s, they came by the millions, mostly from Europe, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Poland, Russia. Their clothes were threadbare, their English broken, their skin pale, but still not quite right. In New York, they passed through Ellis Island, where doctors inspected their eyes, their teeth, their posture. One limp could send them back across the ocean. One cough could separate a mother from her child. For many, America began not with a welcome, but with a number pinned to their chest. They came for freedom. What they got was suspicion. The Irish were called drunkards. The Italians were called criminals. Jews were ridiculed for their religion. The Chinese were called invaders. Mexicans were called thieves. Every group, no matter how desperate, was greeted with the same question. Are you really American? Because America has always been a country built by immigrants, and also a country terrified of them. At the same time the Statue of Liberty was raised, her torch glowing with the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," the government passed laws to keep them out. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act banned an entire ethnicity from entering the country. No other law like it had existed in American history. It would stand for over 60 years. The message was clear. You could build our railroads, cook our food, clean our homes, but you could not become one of us. And yet they stayed. They formed Chinatowns, Little Italies, Jewish quarters, Korean districts, Vietnamese markets, Filipino communities. They passed down recipes, stories, songs. Their accents faded, but their roots remained. And slowly, against the current, they became American, not by shedding who they were, but by surviving in spite of it. Immigration didn't just shape America's economy. It shaped its soul. Every wave of newcomers brought something: food, music, language, labor, laughter, pain. They worked in factories, mines, farms. They took jobs others refused. They paved roads and carried bricks. They sewed clothes in sweatshops with no windows and no rest. They were paid less, often cheated, often attacked, and still they stayed. But even as they contributed, they were punished. In the 1920s, fear took hold again. The government imposed immigration quotas, numerical limits based on nationality. More from Northern Europe, fewer from Southern and Eastern. Asians? Almost none. The idea wasn't hidden. It was called what it was: racial engineering. The belief that some cultures were more fit for democracy than others. And yet they kept coming. During World War II, the enemy was fascism, but not all victims were abroad. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up, forced into internment camps, stripped of property, dignity, and rights. Most were citizens. Most had committed no crime. Their faces were enough. And still, many volunteered to fight for the very country that caged them. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, would become the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Because being American was never just about where you were born. It was about what you were willing to risk for a home. In the decades that followed, new immigrants arrived from new directions. Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. Each brought their own story. Cubans fleeing Castro's regime. Vietnamese refugees escaping war. Haitians leaving behind hurricanes and dictatorships. Salvadorans running from gangs and collapsed governments. Syrians leaving cities turned to ash. And with each arrival, America asked the same tired question: why are you here? Do you belong? The irony is painful. A nation built by immigrants, still uncertain whether to open the door. In the 1980s and 90s, immigration became a political battlefield. One side painted immigrants as criminals, burdens, invaders. The other side saw them as essential, moral, human. Border walls rose. Detention centers filled. Families were separated. Children were locked in cages. And the debate raged, not just about laws, but about identity. Who gets to call themselves American? Is it a passport? A birthplace? A language? A flag on your porch? Or is it something deeper, a willingness to believe in the idea, even when the reality falls short? Because immigrants don't come to America because it's perfect. They come because it holds a mirror to their pain and reflects back possibility. And in that mirror, we see everything. The Filipino nurse working 16-hour shifts in a hospital short on staff. The Syrian cab driver who used to be a professor, now driving strangers who never ask his name. The Mexican farm worker picking strawberries for a table he'll never sit at. The Indian engineer designing the future while still sending money home. The Guatemalan child learning English faster than her parents, becoming their translator before she turns 10. The Afghan translator promised safety after helping U.S. troops, still waiting for a visa in silence. They are not invaders. They are mirrors. They show us who we once were. and who we still claim to be. And yes, immigration is complex. It involves law and policy and borders, but it also involves human lives. And any country that forgets itself. Because some of America's greatest gifts came in foreign packaging. Albert Einstein was a refugee. So was Madeleine Albright. So were countless others, authors, doctors, scientists, teachers, who came with nothing but their names and changed everything. But not all contributions are grand. Some are quiet, like a grandmother folding dumplings for a family who still doesn't feel safe. Like a father driving Uber after a lifetime of dignity he left behind. Like a teenage girl writing poetry in 2 languages because she's still learning how to belong to both. Immigrants make America more than a country. They make it a conversation between past and future, between who we were and who we might become. And that's what we must remember. America was never meant to be a melting pot where everyone loses their flavor. It was meant to be a table where each dish brings something new to the feast. So the next time someone asks, why don't they just go back to where they came from? Remind them, we all came from somewhere. And if we're lucky, we're still becoming. Every country has borders, but not every country has a dream. America was not born just from land. It was born from a sentence, from a set of ideas scribbled in ink by men who believed words could shape the world. It's easy to forget how radical those words were at the time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That single sentence, written in 1776, echoed louder than any cannon. It didn't describe a country that existed. It described one that might. A promise yet to be kept. But promises, like people, are messy. The same men who wrote those words also owned slaves. The Constitution they crafted spoke of liberty, but counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. It promised freedom of religion, but silence for women. It created a government, but not yet a society. It was not perfect. It was not even close. And yet, it was alive. Because the genius of the Constitution wasn't in what it guaranteed. It was in what it allowed, change. At its heart, the American Constitution is a paradox. It limits power, but grants it. It protects the individual, but speaks for the collective. It promises equality, but was born in inequality. And over time, that contradiction became the great American dilemma. Who gets to speak? Who gets to vote? Who gets to decide? To answer that, the founders designed structure, 3 branches of government. The legislative branch, Congress, makes the laws. The executive branch, the president, enforces them. And the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, interprets them. In theory, these powers are equal. In practice, they're a tug of war. Congress is the voice of the people, but not always their conscience. Presidents are elected by the nation, but often born from dynasties, privilege, or power. And the Supreme Court? It is unelected, unchanging, and almost godlike in its authority. 9 justices in black robes can define what freedom means for hundreds of millions. They've made decisions that changed lives forever, banning segregation, Brown versus Board of Education, allowing interracial marriage, Loving versus Virginia, legalizing abortion, Roe versus Wade, then reversing it decades later. They've protected speech, then limited it, expanded rights, then narrowed them. Every ruling is a mirror and a battlefield. Because in America, law is not just law. It's memory. It's morality. It's the story we tell ourselves about what kind of country we are. And at the center of that story stands the president. There is no king in America, but there is something close. The president is head of state, commander-in-chief, signer of bills, face of the nation. Elected every 4 years, but watched every day. Loved, hated, blamed, praised. Every word they speak can shake markets. Every misstep can spark wars. Some presidents rise above politics. Abraham Lincoln, who held the nation together by sacrificing everything. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who led through Depression and World War from a wheelchair the public never saw. John F. Kennedy, who challenged Americans to look to the moon and to themselves. Others remind us that power does not equal wisdom. There were scandals, Lies. Wars started under false pretenses. Economies broken by greed. Presidents who turned their back on justice. Who whispered to dictators. Who incited violence. And yet, each was chosen by the people. Or by the electoral system designed by those same founding fathers. Which leads to another contradiction. In America, you can win the presidency without winning the popular vote. It's happened multiple times. Because votes are not counted equally. They are filtered through the Electoral College, a system built not for fairness, but for balance between large and small states, between city and countryside, between past and present. And that's the challenge. America is a democracy, but not a pure one. It's a republic. And that difference, though subtle, is everything. It means that majorities do not always rule. That laws passed in Washington can be blocked by courts in Mississippi. That one senator from a small state can derail a law supported by millions. It means the system is slow, tangled, and often infuriating. But it also means the system can survive. Because at its core, the Constitution is not just about control. It's about containment, of ambition, of corruption, of chaos. It assumes that people are flawed and builds walls to keep them from becoming tyrants. That's why the First Amendment exists. It protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. You can criticize the president, protest the government, write a book that mocks the flag, burn that flag, kneel during the anthem. The Constitution doesn't guarantee agreement. It guarantees disagreement. And that may be its most radical promise. But those rights were not always for everyone. When Black Americans protested, they were met with dogs and hoses. When immigrants marched, they were labeled threats. When women demanded the vote, they were jailed and beaten. When gay people demanded marriage, they were told love was immoral. Every generation has had to fight for the Constitution to mean what it says. And some are still fighting for the right to vote, without ID laws, purges, or intimidation. For the right to live, without fearing a badge or a border guard. For the right to learn history, not just the sanitized version. For the right to love, to choose, to walk, to breathe. Because America is not just built on ideals. It's built on the struggle to live up to them. And every time someone stands in a courtroom and says, "Your Honor, I have rights," they're participating in that struggle. Every time a journalist publishes a truth that makes the government uncomfortable, the Constitution lives. Every time a teenager reads the Bill of Rights and asks, "Does this apply to me?" the document breathes. It is not a relic. It is not holy. It is not perfect. It is a mirror. And like all mirrors, it does not lie, but it does not flatter. What is America? Is it a piece of land between two oceans? A flag stitched with stars? A constitution gathering dust in a glass box? Or is it something else entirely, less visible, harder to name, but more real than any border or anthem? From the beginning, America has been both a myth and a mirror. The myth says we are the land of freedom, the land where dreams are born, the land of the self-made man and the second chance. The mirror tells a different story. It reflects what we often want to ignore, the shadows behind the slogans, the bodies behind the borders, the contradiction between who we say we are and who we have been. The truth is, America is not one story. It's a million stories stitched together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes painfully, often both at once. We were born in contradiction, a revolution for freedom led by men who owned slaves, a constitution that promised equality but delivered it selectively, a nation that welcomed immigrants but feared difference. We are the country of Ellis Island and of the Chinese Exclusion Act, of the Underground Railroad and Jim Crow, of civil rights marches and voter suppression, of the Statue of Liberty and children in cages, of jazz and lynchings, of Silicon Valley and redlining. We are the land of hope and the land of heartbreak, and sometimes the same place at the same time. And yet we keep believing. That's what makes America different. Not because we have always been free, but because we have always believed we could be. Because somewhere in our collective soul is a sentence written not in law, but in longing that things could be better, that we could be better. That democracy, though fragile and flawed, is still worth defending. The American experiment is not finished. It was never meant to be. It's a question, and each generation must answer it again. Who belongs here? Who decides? Who benefits? Who is protected? Who is heard? The answers shift, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, but the question remains. And it haunts us in our classrooms, our courtrooms, our elections, our arguments at dinner tables. It haunts us in every protest sign, every rewritten textbook, every anthem sung and knee taken. Because to be American is not to inherit a perfect system, but to live inside a flawed one and still choose to make it better. It is to be born into promises we didn't write, but can still help fulfill, and to know that even if you weren't invited to the table, you have every right to pull up a chair. America is not the destination. It's the debate. It's not the victory. It's the fight. It's not the answer. It's the echo of a question we're still learning how to ask with honesty. And in that question lives the country's soul. So what is America? Is the dream of someone crossing a desert with a child on their back. Is the fear of a black boy being pulled over on a dark road. It is the pride of a woman casting a vote her grandmother was once jailed for. It is a soldier overseas and a protester in the street. It is the immigrant's first paycheck, the refugee's first sunrise in safety, the poet's first words in English, the teacher in an underfunded school who still shows up, the nurse in a pandemic who keeps going, the teenager who comes out to her family, the father who finally apologizes, the survivor who says, "I believe me," the history teacher who refuses to skip over the hard parts, the student who refuses to forget them. America is not its perfection. It is its persistence, its refusal to stay down, its ability to remake itself again and again through failure, through fire, through faith. It is not what we've always been. It is what we're still becoming. That becoming is messy, loud, divided, but it is also sacred because it means the story isn't over. It means we are still writing it. With every election, every protest, every act of kindness, every time someone says, "I belong here too." America is not finished, and neither are we.